Okay, let's start. It's already 10 past the hour. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all very much for being here with us tonight, in person, in Paris, as well as for those of you who are following us online. Hopefully you can see us and hear us well. Welcome to this public session of the high-level seminar, which the Finance for Development Lab is co-organizing with the Initiative for Policy Dialogue of Columbia University. The theme for this session is From the South African G20 to the French Presidency of the G7, Advancing the Debt and Development Agenda. So I wanted to kick us off. We have a little bit less than an hour, and we'll try to keep 5 or 10 minutes for a couple of questions that we can take from students and others in the room. We wanted to really take a step back tonight and consider with you the fracturing multilateral context in which we're living. 2 weeks ago at the General Assembly of the United Nations, we had starkly different views on multilateralism that were offered. If I could just offer up 3 of them for your reflection. President Macron said, and I quote, "I deeply believe that effective multilateralism has never been more necessary and needs to deliver on development, on the fight against inequality, on health, climate, biodiversity, and technology." The following day, President Trump said, and I quote, "Very sad to see whether the UN can manage to play a productive role. I've come here today to offer the hand of American leadership and friendship. A dramatically better future is within our reach, but to get there, we must reject the failed approaches of the past." And then President Ramaphosa of South Africa noted the celebration of the 80 years of the Bretton Woods institutions and of the and of the United Nations, and talked about the need to seize the opportunity to build a better UN for the next 80 years. What's needed now is a stronger, more capable UN based on a renewed commitment to its founding principles. So, some variety in views on multilateralism. We just came off of a private session on the same topic where Rémy Rioux, the Director General of the French Development Agency, all the way to my left, discussed a recent article published by Adam Tooze in Foreign Policy talking about the end of the development paradigm. So if I could start with you, Rémy, and ask you to offer your reflections on where we stand with regards to the development paradigm, and from your standpoint and vantage point, how can public development banks help us actually move forward in the current difficult context?
Thank you, Sima, and good afternoon, everybody. Good to discuss international cooperation here in Paris, at Columbia, at the invitation of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue and the Finance for Development Lab, so thanks for that. And particularly important, yes, to have this discussion at a time where a shift, let's say a structural movement is happening, and when multilateralism, of course, is under severe threat. So we know about 1/3 of ODA disappearing since 2024, so for only 2 years, which is, I think, the first time when there's no macro crisis, we see this happening. And it's not only in the US, it's also in Europe, everywhere. We will discuss climate probably, and the way it is intertwined with development, and probably after a golden decade, we are losing track of or searching at least for reconciliation between these 2 priorities. The ranking of the countries in the world and the way to allocate international investments has also become blurred. You know, there are 61 countries in the world that are both qualified as developing and developed. So 1 country out of 3. We don't know how to qualify them. And of course, hidden in this fog, there's a specific issue for Africa. I don't know if you've read the last World Bank report 2 weeks ago about investments, and especially FDI in the world, well, there's no investment in Africa. As simple as that. And so it's, when you look at the figures, it's a shame. I mean, and it has to be corrected rapidly. And of course, we see this twin resentment rising and distrust in international fora as long as we do not find a solution. And yes, I was struck and let's say horrified by this paper that was published a few weeks ago in Foreign Policy. It's not called by Adam Tooze, so it's not called the end of ODA. It's called the end of development itself. So of course it's about SDGs being the end of something, a bit of an inflated and useless version of the MDGs, which I think is completely, it's plain wrong. There's also this idea of, let's say, a zero-sum economics. So of course we know the tariffs and all these things you have to gain from the others. But in this paper, there's also the idea that we fear and we don't want the development of other countries. So that's troubling and a bit of an attempt to, let's say, outbid right-wing pessimism, realism from the progressive side. So somehow international cooperation is pressed between so many criticism that, of course, we have to react. So that's I'm sure the idea of this panel, and maybe my experience since I became the CEO of AFD 10 years ago, and especially our collective work with fellow public development banks. So the point is we have to recreate empathy, trust, buy-in in the system. And we are trying to do that by recognizing, embarking national public financial institutions, which have been overlooked forever. It's not against multilateralism. It's the idea of re-legitimizing multilateralism by giving recognition to national peers. Because global challenges do not necessarily start or need global answers. I mean, it starts by what you are doing in your own country. And good news is there are 550 public development banks in the world, from the World Bank to the regional multilateral development banks to our friends of DBSA in South Africa, or in France, Caisse des dépôts et consignations, which is the oldest public financial institution in the world since 1816, when Napoleon stole the money of the French people. And we had to protect it and turn it into long-term investments and infrastructure. So now all of us, we know each other. There's a database, there's a website, there are summits. So this is a done thing. And question now is for, of course, governments, private sector, of course, multilateral institutions to try to mobilize and leverage this huge public platform. It's 2.5 billion existing investments each year. So it's 15% of total investments in the world that are public. So of course, following public guidance, and of course, connecting with our banks who are issuing bonds, so connected with the private sector. So that's where we are. And of course, I want to thank the G20 presidency this year in South Africa. We were fully in the discussion. We organized the 5th Finance in Common Summit, that's the name of this coalition, in Cape Town in February. The Sustainable Finance Working Group just finalized its report to the ministers and leaders. And it's totally part of the narrative and a lot of very good proposals coming from the G20. And of course, we hope, I'm the head of AFD, that we are in Paris, that next year the French presidency of the G7, and you know President Macron explained, and I'm sure he will invent a new format, which will be beyond the G7, of course, with all willing partners in the world to help set, well, recognize this architecture, vast architecture, but also set the right framework and set of incentives that would go farther than ODA, let's say, and maybe change regulation, maybe mobilize private capital like never. And so all the discussion that is ongoing for years now about SDR, about guarantee mechanisms, about debt restructuring, we think we have a platform, a group that will help them happen. That's as simple as that, and we stand ready for that.
Thank you very much, Rémy.
And if I may add something, just to say that there's a momentum in this group, there's force in this group, I just want to highlight that recently you had this Shanghai Cooperation Organization gathering in Tianjin. I don't know if you noticed, but one of the conclusion was to create a new public development bank. And so when I hear that, I think, okay, this is becoming serious. So, you know, a good idea translates into an initiative. A historic idea transforms into a public development bank. That's the story of the World Bank, that's the story of EBRD, that's the story of Caisse des Dépôts. And so we have to look carefully at that. And in the US, maybe you've heard that there's a bill now proposed to the Congress to reauthorize an institution that is called USDFC, which was created by President Trump in 2018 in the BUILD Act, which is the public development bank, international public development bank of the United States of America. The initial authorization was for $60 billion financial firepower. The proposal that is discussed at Congress this day is to push it to 250. So multiply by 4 or 5 the capacity of this institution. So I'm sure that somehow international cooperation will be revived through an investment narrative, of course, with the idea of finding back the way to unlock solidarity, especially for the most vulnerable countries and for global public goods. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rémy. Nick, if I could now turn to you. So Nick Mabey is the CEO of E3G, a climate change think tank with a global outlook. Nick, you have decades and decades of climate diplomacy experience. I think the COP process has never been perhaps more criticized than now. Rémy just offered a couple of thoughts on how to revive multilateralism and cooperation through public development banks, through investments. What's your view on the COP process and how we can uphold it and what it can deliver in this very difficult time?
Great, thanks a lot. And I was taken by Rémy's idea that once an idea is really important, it becomes a development bank. At the 2009 financial crisis, we helped build the UK's Green Investment Bank that was the world's first national green investment bank, and then was properly privatized by the UK 5 years later, and then reinvented 5 years after that. So I'm not quite sure what that means, apart from the UK is a bit inconsistent when it comes to thinking an idea has its time. But it's an important point, because I think this is all about investment, the investment we want, rather than the investment we get from the financial system. And I think that interplay between the politics of what society wants and what markets will deliver is at the core of this discussion. And I think, and the reason we have a COP is because we know that magically things won't happen on their own and we need to cooperate. So where are we? Enteko, I'm going to start glum and I'm going to get happier, which is not like me. I usually do the other way around. So, but to start with it, this is probably the worst and most difficult time I've seen in geopolitics and climate diplomacy, not because of the climate, but because of all the other things going on. There is fragmentation. But worse, there's distraction. There is virtually no climate diplomacy going on at a senior level at the moment, compared to, say, Glasgow or Paris or around Copenhagen. Even if it failed, at least it failed. People were talking to each other at leaders level. At the moment, we don't have that conversation because there are so many other things to do and everybody's so internally focused. And that's why you get a situation where the European Union is probably going to agree a very ambitious climate target for 2040, but it's not going to agree in time to influence any global diplomacy, particularly that of China, the world's largest emitter, because of issues about internal economics and disputes. So we'll still do the same thing, which is in a way that gives us very little international leverage. We're at a time where concerns about the European car industry and the Brazilian car industry and the Turkish car industry and the Indonesian car industry and the Australian car industry means tariffs on Chinese EVs, because cheap, clean cars are now a problem, not a solution. But there were real issues there about that. But that is the world we're in, where it's more global and more geopolitical than ever, but the politics is more local and more inward-looking. And we do risk a real erosion of empathy between countries. And this is great to talk about geopolitics and investment and transactionalism, but what gets left out of that, what gets squeezed out of that, are the needs of people. People in poor communities, people in poorer countries, people who don't have leverage in that voice. So this is really a choice point. Do we have a system, and what I think of when I hear development, it's not just money flowing to where it makes money, but can we politically guide the money to where it's most needed as well as to where it makes money? Because just investing where it makes money is just designing markets. That's not a development process. So that for me is where is a real challenge, and can we keep those structures going? And then I'm going to get happier, because the good thing is there's incredible progress. Sometimes when I hear people talk about climate and the COP process, you'd think there was something dreadful going on. Well, since Paris, the amount of clean investment in the world per year has increased by 5 times, and it's twice the amount for fossil. If you told anybody the conclusion of the Paris Agreement that was going to happen, they would have laughed at you. And 90% of power investment last year was in clean tech, and that's growing. Africa is actually seeing a solar boom, so is Pakistan, so is others, because actually the price is so cheap now. It's overcoming some of the barriers, not for everybody, but for the people who can afford it in those policies. And we've actually, since I started working on climate, seen the threat, the largest temperature we're looking at, halve over that time because of the cooperation we've driven through the climate treaty. And sometimes we don't recognize that. So working together works. It's imperfect, it's annoying, it's complicated, it's obtuse, but it does work. And it worked because it drove technology and investment. But we still have a long way to go, because at the same time, all the science of climate got a lot worse. So science was very good at predicting temperatures and very bad at predicting how bad temperatures would be for people and how unstable the system was. So we used to think 3 degrees was livable. Now people know that that's not livable. But that was in the 1990s, that's what we thought. That was the best science of the time. So we're doing really well, the science has got worse, and we're shifting. We've done the treaties, we've done the words, and Belém has to show it can pivot the climate regime from agreeing text to delivery. And that's very hard because it's essentially a text-based situation. So what does Belém need to do? Well, it needs to show we're serious. It needs to show and demonstrate, particularly to the public and business and investors who aren't going to be at COP30. So the only time the world hears about climate change, and you can see it in the media graphs, is around COP, which is why it's such an important political moment. It's a political forum. It's not a implementation forum. That's what Rémy does every day. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to do better on the mitigation problem. China's target was far too low, 7 to 10%, when it needed to do 30%. It's not going to change its target, but we need to encourage China and others, including lots of major economies, to make better commitments on methane, better commitments on coal, better commitments on increasing grid rollout, all other things we do. And we can do that. That's a partnership process. There's a lot of processes going on. We need to do better on finance. There will be a non-binding, non-negotiated finance roadmap agreed at COP. It doesn't sound great, but that's a finance roadmap where the US isn't in the room. And that means it's got ability to be more ambitious about shaping forward processes in the IMF and the World Bank and elsewhere. But particularly, it also needs to make sure we put forward new pledges on public finance from the donors. That's part of the deal of the COP, that partly because of the responsibility of previous emissions, we need to put public finance on the table, and those pledges have to be put forward, even though ODA is shrinking. In donor countries, we've got a climate commitment, and that's going to be a big decision. And the last one, because this doesn't happen through the market, we need a huge package on adaptation and resilience. Countries are being hit worse. It's not just about money, but it is about money. But it's also about how do we help them with early warning and science. And part of that is making sure the defunding of scientific institutions by the US administration is picked up in Europe, and I know France is very interested in that. But it's also about changing rules so countries can access capital. It's about changing the insurance markets, providing better insurance. So there's a whole set of issues that leaders can address in BELEM that we can negotiate around, and also we can form, groups of countries can form partnerships, we already have hundreds of partnerships to take forward. And that's the kind of package we need to look. But in the end, we need to look at BELEM and say, not just multilateralism carried on, that's not good enough. People will agree something, but actually they've put real impetus behind the key gaps in the process we know exist because they're measured and moving forward. We will not close the middle, not be perfect, but we have to show in this new context, we not just kind of carry on that we can do more. But the last thing BELEM has to do is make this switch. We'll hear a lot about the implementation COP, as if we never did any implementation in the past. But there is an issue that there is just not much left to negotiate, which makes negotiators mainly very happy because there's actually 86 negotiating tracks at COP, of which probably 3 are meaningful. The legacies exist in these processes. So what are we going to do after this? Well, we've got to understand what COP is for. It's politics, it's for monitoring progress, it's for putting pressure for change. And looking forward, we need to look at that. But it's also, so we're going to have to do a lot of work in other places. So a few places I think we should be doing work. Firstly, we need to drive a lot of changes in the financial system. A lot of countries have to agree that, but primarily European Union and China have to agree that. They didn't manage to agree at their summit this year on a substantive program. But as two countries or regions that both got 25% of their GDP growth from clean energy last year, they've got quite a lot of interest in driving global investment in clean tech. So they could lead a process at the IMF to make sure climate was taken into account in economic surveillance and debt sustainability, giving countries more hope. They could lead the process or support the process on MDBs and NDB reform, and they can support the process on financial regulation and changing financial markets and prudential regulation, which the US is currently pushing back on. There are huge geopolitical problems between those two countries, not least Ukraine. But the question is, can they find common purpose around climate? And that's a very acute political problem at the moment, but it's one that's surmountable. So COP's political, we've got some big countries driving things, building coalitions for change in the institutions. We need a whole new approach to cooperation, development architecture. What is going to change? It's not development in this area, it's co-creation, it's co-design. We need to completely reform how we engage and work with each other, north, south, south, north, whatever numbers or letters you want to use. This is hard. No one knows how to build a zero emissions resilient economy. Let's tap into all the talent. That's really important and vital process, which again, Europe's going to be key to. And lastly, we need to involve everybody. So COP is too small to contain the climate transition. It's already 2 trillion. We need it to be nearer 5, 6. Pick a number, something larger than 2. That's not going to happen at COP, and it shouldn't happen at COP. So one of the things we've been doing in EPG, we built London Climate Action Week, which is now the largest event in Europe on climate. But the aim was to reach out beyond the climate bubble and involve not just businesses and firms, but also culture and the public and bottom-up and top-down institutions, sport, fashion, food, to get everybody crowding in to do their bit for the climate. And now there's a Shanghai Climate Action Week, and there was Rio Climate Action Week 2 weeks ago, and Baku Climate Action Week last week, and we're talking to Padua, and we're talking to Prague, and there's Sydney Climate Week as well. This is growing, and this is not done on huge budgets. This is just asking people to come along and join in a very open platform. And it's amazing the energy it produces. So the future of climate action going forward will have a top-down component and a COP component, but it's like the keystone in an arch. It keeps everything together and keeps everything on track, But the rest of the arch is going to be built from the bottom up through the national development banks, through the international financial system, and through people in places building the new economy and the society that will support that. And that, for me, is the exciting area. I don't need to ask Donald Trump's permission to do any of that. But people do need to organize and do it. I think that's, sometimes we forget, just doing things is the way you build the new system. So whatever the new international geopolitical system is going to be, it's not going to be built by talking or writing papers. It will be built by doing and showing it's working. And that's the task which we essentially start at Belém this year.
Thank you so much, Nick. We actually have a Paris Climate Week in 3 weeks, the first ever. Yes. Saul, if I could ask you to now come in and share with us. So Saul is a director at the private office of President Ramaphosa of South Africa. South Africa has the presidency of the G20 this year. What message is South Africa hoping to send developing countries and the rest of the world with its presidency? If you could share with us briefly your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Seema, and hi, everyone. We just ended on a very hopeful note, and I'm going to take you right back to gloom and doom, and then swing you back to hope at the end. But I want very briefly just to talk about, in the context of the G20 and our G20 presidency as South Africa, what we see as the problem that needs to be solved. And then within this geopolitical context, as it is, as fragmented and difficult as it might be, what we can actually do about it. I think the basic problem is that the world faces a financing gap of $4 trillion, as much as $4 trillion per annum to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's worth starting with that because it helps to focus the mind. We've got to find $4 trillion per annum in order to meet those goals that we all made a commitment to. And not only that, but far from making progress towards filling that gap, even if there is investment rising in some areas, on the whole, we're actually widening it. So from the point of view of a typical developing country, you need to mobilize financing for development. Bilateral aid is falling. OECD predicts that ODA will decline by 17% this year. It's 25% the decline for the least developed countries. So you've got this massive shock in aid flows. MDBs and DFIs on the whole are not adequately capitalized, and they're not providing sufficient long-term capital. Debt service costs have risen very sharply. So at the same time as these flows are decreasing, your flows out in terms of debt service, private creditors and official creditors are rising. For low-income countries, interest costs have risen by 2.5 times in the past decade. And to put that into perspective, last year, low-income countries paid interest costs close to $100 billion. And the result of all of that confluence of factors, is that many developing countries are actually facing negative net flows. Some are close to zero, many are negative. So they're actually paying out to creditors in debt service more than they're getting into all of those. So that's not a bad, that's not a good place to be if you're trying to develop your country. And you might say, well, as many people do, well, you can turn to domestic resource or domestic revenue mobilization, taxation, mobilize resources internally. But on top of all of that, you've got $240 billion lost every year to base erosion and profit shifting, tax movers. And just in Africa, you're losing $90 billion per annum to illicit financial flows, money being stolen. So that's the doom and gloom. That's a hard set of problems. At the very, very moment that as a planet, we're trying to face up to a climate crisis and trying to keep making progress in eradicating poverty and trying to reverse the worrying increases in inequality that Professor Stiglitz will tell you about. And so the question is, what do we do? On the one hand, I think there is some cause for hope. And the first reason for hope is that there is a growing consensus, a real kind of convergence on what the problem is, how to characterize it. And I think that's particularly true of debt, which I'll spend a little bit of time on. So just this year, we've had a number of expert reports published on the debt challenge. The Jubilee Commission, chaired by Professor Stiglitz and Professor Guzman in the audience, the UN group of experts on debt, the expert review on debt nature and climate, which Songwe chaired with others, and a number of other reports. And they all say a relatively similar thing, that among other structural problems in the system, over the next few years, developing countries have these very, very high debt redemptions, very high annual debt payments coming due, in part because we took on a lot of debt post-2008, when interest rates were low, and now that tide has gone out, interest rates are right back up, and so we're caught in a kind of trap. And that's a start. I think there's a good shared understanding, if you like, of what the problem is, the extent and the scale of that problem, and what is caused. That diagnosis, though, is not being matched with action. The kind of action and commitment to act is not at the same scale, level of ambition as we talked. And so I think really the challenge is not to find technical solutions, those solutions exist, but to mobilize the political will based on building on that diagnosis, that understanding, to implement the solutions that already exist. So let me just end by saying, where do we think there is scope for action? What are the grounds on which we could reach something? And briefly, the first, I think, on debt is to implement some reforms in the global financial architecture, in the mechanisms that help countries person or a firm declares bankruptcy, there's a bankruptcy court. You go through a legal process that's very well structured. And that doesn't exist for sovereigns. When the government defaults, there is no such process. We now, since 2021, have the common framework on debt treatments, which does outline some sort of structured process, what happens when a country needs to restructure its debt. But that framework is not working well enough. It takes too long. It takes 3-4 years, in some cases, from the time that a country decides to default and to enter restructuring for that to be resolved. And during that time, typically you're still paying interest on your debt. So and you lock down the markets and you can't borrow the new money. So it becomes a real, a very simple thing that you could do to address that, for example, is just to say that when a country enters a restructuring process, there's a standstill in debt service. So while the negotiations unfold, your debt service is paused, and that creates an incentive for everyone, including private creditors, to actually resolve, complete the restructuring process more quickly, because they're not receiving payment what defaults. So we have a framework there, we can build on it, we can improve it incrementally, and make it easy enough and swift and predictable enough that a country that actually should default, that should enter restructuring, because its debt is so unmanageable, has someone to turn, can actually do that. Of course, many countries won't and don't need to enter a restructuring process, and yet are facing these very, very high debt service costs. And there's a line in the Jubilee Commission report which says that countries, although they're not defaulting on their debt, very few countries actually do. They're defaulting on development, they're defaulting on the people, on the environment, and so on. So what do you do for those countries? We have a precedent during COVID, the G20 put in place the Debt Service Suspension Initiative with the DSSI, which suspended debt service for a period of time for low and low middle income countries. So with a grace period and then extended reduce and smooth out your interest payments to help them to respond to COVID. We have a mechanism there as precedent. And there are a number of ways we could do that. Rescheduling. We also have the example recently of Côte d'Ivoire, a country with very high, very expensive debt, supported by the World Bank with credit enhancements to swap out that debt for much cheaper debt, and that's worked well. So we have mechanisms there too that we can scale up and we can use better, we can use them in more countries, we can deploy more funds into them. So in short, I think many of these technical solutions are there. You know, on the debt problem in particular, they're really good. We have good mechanisms, and what we need is the political will to actually, especially from creditors, realize that something needs to be done. That you can't keep talking about how serious the debt challenge is, and this wall of debt that's coming, and not really do something credible and significant about it. And then very finally, we need, even as we address the debt problem, and enable countries, instead of spending that money on debt service, to spend it on health and education, we need to mobilize long-term funding for development. We need to actually crowd in investment to African countries and to developing countries in general. And one of the things that really stands in the way of that investment is the fact that the cost of capital is so high, that the premium, the risk premium on investments, particularly in Africa, is unreasonably high. That even as investors are earning really high returns, for example, on infrastructure projects, with incredibly low default rates, much lower than even much of corporate loans, it's still very expensive, more expensive than it should be, rationally speaking. And so we need to really look at how to address that problem. On the one hand, what the MDBs and public development banks can do about that, through guarantees, credit enhancements, the instruments at their disposal that can reduce the cost of capital and crowd in private investment. We need to look at prudential requirements and where changes or clarifications could be made that enable the banks to unlock more capital and to invest that capital into development. And we need to look at credit rating methodologies as well, because the credit rating agencies, which attach very high levels of risk to these countries and borrowers, where that risk is in many cases, in very few cases, actually materializes, kind of add layers to that problem. So hopefully that gives a little bit of hope, because I think the answers are there. And what it requires, as Rémy said, is a degree of trust, but also a willingness to act, even where there might not be consensus, to start to implement and take forward these kinds of solutions with coalitions of countries and even individual countries and DFIs that are willing to do so. And if we start there and keep that flame alive, then I think you can build that into a really meaningful set of interventions and start to get to that $4 trillion number. It sounds big, but actually it's not impossible.
Thank you so much, Saul. We have 10 minutes left before taking just a couple of questions from the room. We don't have that much time, but to wrap us up, Professor Stiglitz and Dr. Songwe, if you could share with us your thoughts on how the G20 and the G7 could help us prove Adam 2 is wrong and show the world that development still has something to offer to countries that need it. Would be great if you could help us wrap up the conversation. I don't know who wants to go first.
So first, let me express feeling a little bit of optimism about multilateralism. Part of it is based on, if we look at multilateralism over the last 80 years, it's been overall positive, but you also have to see it as, to a large extent, not pushing forward development or addressing problems of global public goods or externalities, but really projecting the power of the advanced countries against developing countries. So if you looked at the rules of trade, the rules of trade were really designed to keep developing countries producing primary products, and the benefits of the global supply chain going to the advanced countries. So the advent of Trump has changed all that. I think people have realized first that the law of the jungle is actually worse than an imperfect global cooperation. So that there's a lot of criticism of the previous system, but we now think the previous system, as imperfect as it was, actually had some advantages. But the second point that's going on right now is the large number of plurilateral initiatives. So that was really strong at the Finance for Development meeting in Seville, where there was a real celebration that the United States was not in the room. That with the United States not being there, the rest of the countries could get together and begin actually doing something about development. And so there was a recognition of really the importance of meaningful multilateralism. And I think this is a big change that hopefully that having seen how bad things can get without global cooperation and recognizing some of the flaws in the previous forms of multilateralism, we can get really to a better multilateralism that really does more for developing countries. So since we have time, a very limited time, let me talk about some of the ways in which the new multilateralism that hopefully will be emerging can actually help development. First, it's a reforming of the global rules. As I mentioned before, the rules have not always, have really been written for the advanced countries. And some of those rules need to be rethought. So for instance, one of the rules is the way the MDBs are treated for their capital requirements by Basel III, which limits the lending. But let me also say at the same time, the United States has loosened its regulatory requirements on banks. I think that was a big mistake, and it would be a big mistake for the rest of the world to try to race to the bottom like we saw before 2008. The reason we have those regulatory requirements on private banks is that if you don't have those, they undertake excessive risk-taking, and we'll have another global financial crisis. We can be sure of that. And so it's one thing to have appropriate regulations for the MDBs. It's another thing to let the private sector go wild. The other kinds of rules have to do with the rules of the IMF and the World Bank. For instance, the way they do debt sustainability analysis. We can reform those, and that will help restructure debt, more flows of funds to developing countries. And there are other rules like much of the money that has been given that goes to developing countries goes for a bailout of the private sector, and a no bailout rule would be helpful. So that's on the area of rules, but then there's money itself. And to me, the most important way that we can help money is really by helping create and support MDBs, multilateral development banks. They have a long-term vision. They have a social purpose rather than the short-termism of the private sector and the focus on just profits. So for me, that's really should be at the center of what is going on. Much more important than financial engineering, blended finance, guarantees. Financial sector loves financial engineering because that's how they make money. But our objective here is to solve the problem of getting real money, resources, not making money for Wall Street, but getting resources for climate change and for development. And that's where you have institutions that are really devoted to doing this, should be at the center. And then the other one is a particular kind of liquidity that the global community can create through SDRs. It's for a kind of money that the IMF creates, and it can be a particularly effective way, especially when it goes through MDBs, of engendering leveraged money for development and finance. Finally, and this goes back to where South Africa is playing a very important role. G20 does affect the global debate. It affects norms. It affects how we see the world. So when Brazil was head of the G20, they began a debate about taxation of the rich, wealth taxation, minimum wealth tax, that has now reverberated in a really interesting discussion here in France. And that's an example of a G20 discussion that really has had global consequences. They've actually started a real initiative on making sure that we don't have vaccine apartheid like we had during COVID-19 and the next pandemic, and that's actually being implemented. South Africa has taken the initiative of doing, as was mentioned, something on access to capital, lowering the cost of capital. And the other initiative was, I was asked to chair a committee to look at inequality and to try to think about how we can put the issue of inequality more permanently on the global agenda. And so that's something that we will be at the center of our work.
Thanks very much, Professor Stiglitz. Dr. Songwe, could I ask you to take us home?
I don't know if I'm taking you home. Thank you so much. Thanks for staying this long. It's 7 o'clock for all of you who have stayed. I think maybe Saul said, we'll end up in the positive or the more optimistic. What we are all struggling about is figuring out how to grow. This is really the biggest sort of conundrum, both for the developed as the developing world. And the debt issue is essentially because the developing world is trying to get more investments. The savings are in the developed world, the investments are happening in the developing world, and we need to find some way of moving those savings from the developed world to the developing world. We also need the developing world to save. And one of the things we haven't talked about enough is local currency financing. If the developing world can save enough, then there will be enough local currency financing. And I think it links a little bit to what Rémy was saying about the national development banks. The benefit of national development banks is that they actually use local currency. And so essentially they are not exposed to the vicissitudes of macroeconomic problems in other countries, right? A famous United States Central Bank governor said, my dollar, your problem, right? He manages his dollar, you manage the problem that comes with it. Many of our countries have just gone through the problem of managing the inflation because of the overextended liquidity that was given in the developed world. So these are some of the things that we need to look at. I think as students, as you're working, I think one of the big questions that we have today is about de-dollarization and what we need to do. And I think that a good research question maybe for you guys is, where is de-dollarization in the development conversation? What should we do? We have SDRs that are pegged to 6 or 7 currencies. Should we do something different? But linked to that is, we have new currencies on the horizon called stable coins. How do we work with stable coins? I think a big conversation that the G20 has been having for a very long time is about remittances. We've talked a lot here about ODA, but the global remittances are much higher than ODA, right? Between Latin America and Africa, I think remittances are a much, much higher share of income that's going. And today, the G20 has been discussing reducing the cost of remittances for the last 15 years, maybe 12 years. Nothing has happened. And now, under the United States Big Beautiful Bill, they're going to tax remittances by another 7%. So essentially, we can say all we're saying here, but the US is going to take, because the US has realized that it's a huge source of income, they're going to tax it, and they're going to take $7 billion off of it, at least for Africa. So maybe stable coins can do something different. So maybe there is a way of, as we begin to think, and a lot of the conversations we've had here are around sort of the traditional concepts. You know, we talked a lot about what we do in those traditional concepts, which are beginning to get stuck. And I say this because, you know, you guys are sort of still studying, and we're all struggling to understand a little bit what is going to be the new paradigm. And I think there is a space for us to open up a little bit. France is going to be running the G7 next year. I think the whole conversation around currencies and the roles of central banks, and I think that Professor Stiglitz has talked about, yes, we should, you know, ensure that Basel works, and we're very happy that Basel has provided the stability where we have not had another financial crisis. But the Basel regulation was done at a time when many of us were not yet, you know, conscious of the constraints of that financial system. So something in the Basel regulation says, if you're not an OECD country, your capital charge is 49%. Just because geography has put me where I am doesn't make any sense, right? Because Basel was working inside an OECD framework. I think those kinds of things we should look at and we should change, right? And my sense is there is a lot of the fine print that we haven't looked at, and it is that fine print that is making the cost of capital high. I speak for African countries, but I think this is true for many Latin American countries. They are developing. AI is making the cost of capital, you know, quite expensive, even as we move to climate. Climate energy investment needs huge initial capex. So you don't have the kind of long-term operational capital. You need immediate capital. That's why we need more debt. Debt is good. That is good if we can have money that we borrow long-term and at the right price to be able to grow. And so the question is, what kind of debt? What is the tenure of that debt? And maybe MDBs are beginning to sort of say, yes, we can do much more long-term debt. How do we then develop and ensure that this long-term debt is being transparently deployed? Because there's a whole conversation around use of proceeds, whether it's debt coming from the MDBs, the debt coming from bilaterals. It's not yet clear that we're doing enough on the transparency side. I think a lot of the work that Rémy has been doing with the FIX and all that, and he mentioned the GEMS database, which is the IFC database, the International Financial Institutions database, that actually shows that borrowing to Africa is not as bad as the perception. Now, if we as MDBs have had this data for 25 years, why didn't we release it so that we can change the perception, right? And I think there is a lot of conversation that we need to have around what do we do with our data in an age of AI, and you guys, all of us, you know, now have data at our fingertips. Can we use that better and differently so that we have better investments? When we do the guarantees, that the use of proceeds is more important, because when the resources come, it's not enough that they come. It's even more important that the implementation is done well so that you get the rate of return that is needed to avoid another debt crisis that we will have. So I think more and more we're beginning to see the private sector come. Yes, the private sector is coming, maybe not at the pace at which we would like them to come, but if we can bring better policies in many of these developing countries, and there are many countries today that are taking care of their macroeconomic frameworks that are doing much better than they did before. And we need to, I think, ensure that those countries can do better by making sure that the DSAs include the price and the cost of climate change so that they have the right amount of space to grow. It's not enough to do a halfway investment. Halfway investments are much more expensive than trying to do the full investment and then paying out for it. And because countries don't have the resources that they need, they are not investing enough in human capital, they're not investing enough in infrastructure, and they're certainly not investing enough in technology. And I think that really is the conversation that we're having today, is how do we make sure that, you know, the huge sort of tipping points of demographics, of urbanization, of climate change, we are able to finance them in a way that is sustainable and provides a better future. And I think there is hope from everything that we've heard from the climate change, from the work that the G20 is doing and pushing forward. For sure, the fix, Rémy always likes to say that the national development banks are richer than the multilateral development agencies and we should push them, and he's right. And of course, all the work that Professor Stiglitz has been doing, I think what it shows is there is hope. We can do this better, we can do this differently. We are going through a transition in MDBs, but maybe it's a good transition because the ideas that we will get from your research hopefully will help us to design a much stronger and much more effective system going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vera. I'm afraid it's getting late, so we might need to skip the questions and close, but thank you all for sharing your ideas and giving us reason to hope. Thank you to our highly esteemed panel. Please join me in giving them a round of applause, and thank you all for being here tonight.
So we should have a honk.